Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed in a listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Megan McClure. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to first off thank the Leadership Staff Professional Association, or LSS, for sponsoring this webinar and the support of a generous e-learning grant from NCSL. Thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. My name is Megan McClure, and I'm the NCSL liaison to LSS, and I will be moderating our webinar today. A couple of quick technical notes before we get started. The presentation slides can be downloaded at any time during the presentation. Just click on the media library icon located in the upper right-hand corner. It looks like a yellow piece of paper. This webinar will be archived within 1 week, and you can go to the NCSL website to find those archived webinars. And you can ask questions at any time by entering it into the box located on the lower left-hand side of the screen. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Larry Schooler is a father of 2 and a husband of 1. He's also the Director of Consensus Building and Community Engagement for the Denver-based firm Engaged Public, creators of a Balancing Act budget engagement software. He's a senior fellow for the National Civic League, an adjunct faculty member at Northwestern, and a subject matter advisor for 100 Resilient Cities. He's worked and spoken across the U.S. and in Europe on topics ranging from consensus building and dispute resolution to public engagement and civic involvement. Larry is completing a PhD in conflict resolution and is the author of a forthcoming book on truth and reconciliation commissions. Thanks for talking with us today, Larry. Take it away.
My pleasure, Megan. Thank you so much, and good day, everyone. I know it's good morning to some of the folks in Nevada and elsewhere in the Pacific time zone, but good afternoon to everyone else. It's my distinct honor to be part of this presentation today. I think it's kind of my 3rd or 4th chance to work with NCSL, and I'm very happy to be doing so. I am going to first open up with a slide that a sort of an homage to my heritage as a former resident of Austin, Texas, where we are the live music capital of the world. And yes, that is a self-proclaimed title. But there was a song recorded by both one of my heroes, Billy Joel, because I play the piano, and it was covered later by Garth Brooks there on the right-hand side. It was called Shameless, and don't worry, I'm not going to sing. I think that's a little much for an office webinar. But they recorded this song, and it has a couple of lyrics in it that have always been very relevant to me in the work that I do in consensus building and community engagement. So they said, I don't have the power now, but I don't want it anyhow, so I got to let it go. And thought I'd never compromise, oh, but you convinced me otherwise, which, of course, I think should be the mantra for all married men, but that's another story. But let's unpack. So thought I'd never compromise, oh, but you convinced me otherwise. I think one of the things that I want us to consider when we look at consensus building in the public domain is the chance to really get people to migrate from entrenched positions to understanding their underlying interests. And what I mean by that is so often in policy matters, whether it be at the legislative level or at other levels of government, folks are either for something or, as they say in Texas, against it. They're just taking a position of either being in favor or opposed to a particular policy matter. And they end up developing feelings of, if not hostility, certainly sort of stereotypical understandings of what people on the other side think or feel or are about. And that's obviously typically an unhealthy dynamic. And what we're trying to do here in consensus building is really understand what's at the heart of the positions that people are taking. What are those underlying interests? So, for example, if we take something like immigration, why might someone be in favor of a wall along the border? What is it that they're concerned about? Is it safety? Is it security? Is it some sense of fairness and wanting to make sure everyone gets a fair chance at entering the United States or goes through the same process? Why might someone be on the other side of an issue like that? Are they the descendants of immigrants, perhaps, or are they, just coming at it from a different vantage point? So it's very important, I think, when we're trying to help untie knots in public policy conflict or in contentious public policy matters, to be able to, get to those underlying interests rather than simply, assuming that we can glean what we need to know from positions, because oftentimes I think positions lead us to have to choose one side or the other. And when we can get interests going and develop ideas that meet all of those underlying interests, we then can start to come up with proposals that actually turn out to be win-win. And that is a cliche, but I think it's an important one to consider, because we don't always have to choose one side over the other. If we can devote the energy and time and resources to really getting to what is at the heart of people's concerns, and then brainstorm ideas that satisfy those concerns, then I think we can really develop win-win solutions. So that's kind of that part of the lyric that really speaks to me in this work. And then the other part, just to go back for a moment, thought I don't have the power now, but I don't want it anyhow, so I've got to let it go. I think we all know, working in legislatures, that while, of course, our legislators have power, they can, enact policy, it's very difficult to have a legislator enact policy without the involvement of the public that elected that person. And, oftentimes if the public feels as if their voices aren't heard throughout the course of a policymaking process, even if they might ultimately be supportive of whatever that policy is, they're going to be miffed that they weren't able to have a seat at the table. Think about our ordinary lives. If our spouse or our partner or someone else that we're involved with in our sort of day-to-day personal lives makes a decision that's really going to affect us and we don't really get a say, we might eventually go along with it, but we might, feel a little disheartened that we didn't really get a voice in something that was really going to impact us. And so I think the same is true in public discussions, and that's one of the reasons why, we have to try to involve those voices proactively and productively in the conversation up front. So before I get to this concept of civic fusion, we were starting in the chat window to kind of learn a little bit about where folks are logged in from, but I'd love to ask a couple of poll questions with an eye towards learning a little bit more about people's perspectives and knowing kind of what their roles might be in some of this. So there should be a poll question visible to you now on a screen, and I guess the poll is now open, thanks to whoever did that. So what role are you specifically playing in terms of trying to build consensus on state issues? Do you communicate to media what was decided? Do you listen to testimony and then recommend compromises? Do you meet with lobbyists and decide which side is the better solution? Are you on the research side, maybe something else? So interestingly, we have a lot of researchers. We have a lot of technical experts, it looks like, as well as a number of folks who answered other. So I'd love for those who answered other to chime in the chat window and maybe share a little bit more about the specific role that you play. It must be that I didn't provide some of the right choices to you, in terms of delineating who might be on this webinar. But we do have a lot of folks who do research, and I think that's really important to be part of any consensus building process. So we have some legislative staff within the Senate chamber. We have some administrative nonpartisan staff. Ooh, we've got a fellow Floridian. Hello, Lucy. I'm in Fort Lauderdale today. Someone in the professional development office. That's great. So it's great to have such a diverse mix of folks on this call. I think we have maybe one or two other poll questions if we could move to the next one here in just a minute. So we'll get that next question up here shortly. So a question more at a macro level: how does your legislature typically resolve conflicts when it comes to competing interests? Do they have the groups all come to the public hearing and then they take a vote? Do they meet with lobbyists and pick one that, pick a side based on kind of what they've been lobbied on? Do they have interest groups draft legislation? Do they involve the public directly? Do they get a task force involved in the matter? I'm impressed to see how much of each various legislatures seem to be doing. There's a wide array of responses to this. It looks like a lot of folks, of course, have public testimony, which is no surprise, but I'm impressed to see how many legislatures might convene a task force, because I think that while those can be very time-consuming, they oftentimes can be very, very helpful in generating some of the kinds of win-win solutions that we're talking about, as well as generating some public support for whatever's being proposed once it finally makes its way to the public after the deliberations. So I think that can be very valuable. So I appreciate your answers on those, and I honestly can't remember if I have any other questions. I think I'm done with the poll questions at this point, so we will go back to the slides. I want to introduce you to a concept that a colleague and mentor of mine, Susan Podziba, coined called Civic Fusion. I'm not a scientist. I guess I'm a social scientist, but I'm not a physical scientist, so I'm not going to be able to speak that intelligently on fusion, but you might be familiar with it from the realm of nuclear energy. So the idea that you have charged protons that are brought close enough together to engage forces and overcome their otherwise polarizing magnetic charges. And so the notion here is in civic fusion, you have the potential for people with potentially very diametrically opposed points of view brought together in a sort of safe space, in a setting in which they can share their views without feeling as if they're going to be attacked or shouted down, as is often the case in a town hall meeting or even some public hearings, and give them the chance to work together on a solution. And I think, importantly, one of the conditions for civic fusion is, both sides kind of need the involvement of a legislature or some sort of other governmental or elected body in order to resolve whatever conflict they've had. And perhaps they've each tried to offer solutions either through lobbying or other means or activism, and those solutions haven't held or they haven't generated enough support. And so they're looking for a way forward, and the potential for, like I said, even diametrically opposed points of view to get together and find some common ground is very high. But it does take some more in-depth exploration of what's really at the heart of the interests that they, the positions that they are taking. So these are some of the important principles that I think apply to the formation of consensus. And I think this is true not just in government, but in a lot of different arenas. One is, again, I think the active participation by all, and that may seem a little complex when you're dealing with the state legislature. Of course, you all have millions of people that, in theory, could be impacted by what you're working on. So I think it's incumbent upon anybody working in this space to do a very robust analysis of who the stakeholders really are and do your best to have those voices represented in some fashion, whether it be at hearings, as members of the task force, what have you, and really be able to demonstrate that you have involved those parties that are going to be most affected by whatever you're doing in the discussion about where the consensus might be. It's really interesting to talk about the second bullet in terms of how many people in the call identified as doing research and offering technical advice, because as we well know, we're living in an era in which it's very difficult sometimes to arrive at a sort of agreed upon shared set of facts and information. But I, for one, having worked on these kinds of processes for now more than a decade, think that it's obviously next to impossible if you can't at least get some agreement as to what the actual situation is, whatever the particular topic is. And so it's important to involve as much outside information as possible, whether it be university-based or other government agency-based, or just information that's coming from sources that the entire group is willing to trust. Could be from the media, although, and I am a former journalist, so I certainly put a lot of stock in what's reported in much of the media, but we know that some media sources are trusted more than others. But whatever the sources are, I think it's critical to try to establish that common base of information for the group. It's also important to create that atmosphere of sharing, and what I mean by that is the notion of creating a sense that if someone's going to share an opinion, even if that opinion is going to be unpopular with either the legislature or the audience, that we as conveners, within our legislatures, really respect everyone's right to share their opinion and not face any kind of retribution or hostility as a result of that. I mean, we certainly need look no further than some of the conversation that takes place on social media to see, how quickly backlash can emerge after someone, shares an opinion. And unfortunately, on much of social media, we are helpless to do much about that because the platforms are often controlled by outside, companies, organizations. But in the context of, the processes that we convene, we can be the ones to kind of say, we're going to respect all points of view. We're going to respect disagreement. We're going to allow people to share their points of view and not immediately react and not immediately question, the veracity of what they're saying, but instead honor the fact that they have those points of view. I think we also need to be careful not to try to be too hasty in looking for an agreement. We're often so excited by the prospect of arriving at consensus that sometimes we sort of force a square peg into a round hole in terms of trying to get the group or the collective set of interests to agree. And I think it's very important to make sure we understand where there is agreement and where there is disagreement so that we can honor that as we move through a decision-making process. And also I think the disagreement can help us understand where there might be unmet needs. So, for example, there could be a disagreement about the best ways to protect our natural resources. There could be agreement that needs to be a priority, but there could be disagreement about how that can best be achieved. There may be some groups that think, regulation, new regulation is the best way to achieve it. There could be others that think it's different, but if there's agreement on that core principle, that can really open up a lot of possibilities. And I think that, rather than simply saying, that'll never work, which I'm sure you've heard in one or more meetings that you've been a part of, we've tried that, it'll never work, or that's crazy, or something along those lines, the more specific we can be in getting folks to articulate what they're concerned about in a particular proposed solution, the more likely we are to get at options that will address everybody's concerns. So if someone says that'll never work, we need to know why. We need to know what it is that they're so concerned about and perhaps what they would support instead. It's often easier for someone to kind of shoot down a lot of other ideas rather than come up with their own. And I think it's very important for us to challenge all of the folks in our decision-making processes to put forward what they can support and not simply let them sit back and shoot down things that they oppose. There's a very well-respected facilitator in my field named Sam Kaner who came up with these core values to participatory decision-making that I think are important, one of which that we haven't talked about as much so far is this idea of mutual understanding and accepting the legitimacy of each other's needs and goals. In other words, going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's very, very easy and very common, particularly during campaigns, during politicking, and at the elected levels, for folks to lean on kind of, stereotypes or commonly used phrases. So, standing up to big business or, denigrating the interests of environmentalists by calling them tree huggers or, something along those lines. And I think no matter how much we may not sort of agree with a person's perspective, it's still theirs. They still get to have it. We can't deny them their perspective. We can't say that it's an illegitimate one. We have to accept that they have needs, they have goals, and they have a perspective. And the more that we can respect that and accept it, the more likely I think it is that they're going to sort of come to the table with us and look for those kinds of inclusive solutions. And another thing that I think is critical here is this notion of consensus involving folks' willingness to commit to implement what they endorse. So what does that mean? Consensus isn't necessarily the same thing as unanimity. It's not everybody's first choice. I mean, I think that if it were, there probably wouldn't be a webinar on this topic, and it probably wouldn't be as tricky to reach. Consensus is really about finding a solution that everyone can live with and is willing to support. And so that may be something that is well short of their top choice or what they would decide in a vacuum if it were just them deciding it. But nevertheless, they've come to a place where they're willing to support it. As an example, I worked on a task force in Texas that was evaluating how to use hotel occupancy tax, and there were any number of different folks interested in using it for different purposes. And there was a sharp dividing line around the notion of expansion to convention center as one of the ways in which that hotel occupancy tax could be used. And I think what a lot of folks were willing to do was support the expansion of the convention center if it meant also increased revenue for other interests. So in other words, when people are willing to not just give lip service in a meeting to something they support, but actually stand up for it and support it in the media, support it with their constituents, actively engage in supporting it and working for its implementation and adoption going forward, that really strengthens the power of the consensus that's been reached and really helps the lawmakers, helps administrators and other policymakers to be that much more successful in carrying this out. I apologize. I was briefly kicked off the platform here, so it'll take me just a second. I don't know if Jessica or Jen or Megan can advance the slide. I don't have the cursor here at the moment. If one of you all could just move to the next slide, that would be helpful. For some reason, it's not coming up. There we go. We've talked a little bit about some of these elements, but I want to go into some additional detail here. We talked about sound, unbiased information. We also have kind of gotten a little bit at this notion of underlying values, and this is going to be different in every topic in every state, and so that's why it's important to kind of spend some time thinking about it and talking about it with the various interests. And some of this may seem really obvious. So, for example, you're dealing with a chamber of commerce, a statewide chamber of commerce. Well, it may seem obvious what their underlying values might be, that they, are advancing the interests of business and so on. But I think there's more to it than that. I think they have mission statements and, statements of values within their organization. And on a particular topic, whether it be immigration or environmental issues or what have you, they may have a different set of key values that apply. So I think it's really important in dialogue with these organizations that you're working with that you really try to understand what it is that might actually be at the heart of their concern about that particular and specific issue. And I think that makes a big difference in eventually generating viable solutions. Now, when we talk about determining a variety of viable solutions, I'll talk more in a minute about what it means to really do that. And it doesn't just mean evaluating one or two proposals from a couple of major interest groups. It really means a fairly open-ended conversation where just about any idea is welcome, so as to really allow for a bunch of different compelling ideas to come forward, and then determining which of those solutions align with those underlying values that we've established at the beginning of our process. And then when we talk about making the best decision possible, we're obviously going to always face limitations. They could be time constraints. They could be resource constraints. They could be federal laws that we have to respect and can't, supersede. They could be decisions that won't, fly as much with one audience as with another. But at the end of the day, if we can find something that all of these core interest groups can support, that's, I think, the best decision that we can possibly make. We'll go to the next slide. I'm sorry, I'm still not able to advance the slides. Someone can advance. Thank you very much. One of the other things I think is important as we think about a consensus process is exactly what we're trying to accomplish. Are we looking for processes in which we really want to hear from as much of the state, as much of the population as possible? Are we really, wanting, for example, to get broad buy-in in a big transportation bond, a set of capital improvements in transportation? Or perhaps we're more concerned about inclusion, where we want to kind of focus more on making sure all of the major interests in the state, the major, interest groups and political groups are involved, and they're sort of helping to co-produce whatever decision we're going to make. So that might be the budget, the state budget. That might be, a major piece of policy that changes the direction the state's going to take. Something like that might be a case where we want something that's a little bit more focused on inclusion and sort of more in-depth and rigorous work with those key groups, rather than highly participatory processes where we're really trying to reach kind of the general public and get to different parts of the state. So we are, I think, looking for a few key things. We need to know what it is we're trying to get at the end. Are we looking for a policy? Are we looking for the components of a bond referendum? Are we looking for a constitutional amendment? Are we looking for, a new statute? We also may have a complementary goal, which is important. In other words, we don't just want to produce a piece of legislation, we want to improve the quality of life for our residents. We want to increase the number of people that move to our state or that stay in our state, or the number of businesses that open in our state, or the air quality in our state. So I think it's really important to think about what that complementary goal or goals might be, not simply what we're ultimately trying to produce in the way of a statute or a report or a bond. And then, of course, we have the sessions in which we would hopefully negotiate amongst our different groups, or maybe do some shuttle diplomacy. When it refers to outreach and consultations, that's often the means by which we get public opinion. So that might be online tools with surveys, that might be televised town hall meetings, that might be mobile outreach where we're visiting different communities and visiting different events to get folks' opinions. We talked about trusted information, making sure we have a shared base of knowledge about what the situation is related to the topic. And then when it comes to logistics, where are we going to meet? Who's going to be in those meetings? Will they be completely open to the public, or will some of them be private? Will this be a publicly appointed body? I think there are pluses and minuses to having fully public task forces. There's one meeting here right now relative to the issues of school and gun safety after the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in Parkland, Florida. And I think the benefit of a public process is obviously the transparency. There's also, though, I think a challenge of some participants in those meetings feeling a little bit hamstrung in what they want to share when they're in a completely public and often live broadcast setting. So those things need to be weighed. If it were up to me, I would sort of have a blend of some private consultations or private negotiations mixed with some public meetings, almost like a subcommittee, full committee type of format. I want to also bring you into the idea of mapping out your process. I mean, I think a lot of times we're very fixated on a single event like a hearing or a ballot measure that's going up for a vote, and we don't spend as much time thinking about how we might undertake a process that would eventually produce consensus. So again, this is from Susan Podziba and her work on Civic Fusion, and she's mapped out here, and it might be a little difficult to see in your screen, so I'll try to walk you through it. She's mapped out a consensus process for a community that was essentially writing or rewriting its city charter, almost akin to rewriting a state constitution. And what you'll see on the left-hand side is initially some mail-outs to the public to get them thinking about ideas, and then a training of facilitators. You see this little stick figure at an easel, which then births several stick figures at easels, hosting public community meetings, as well as a public forum, this lower little picture here. And that leads to a set of kind of basic principles that the broader public contributes to as the charter is going to be written. And then subsequent to that, they had a team of folks, kind of like a task force, that would be working for several months on the development of a draft charter, which would then, as you move from left to right, go back out for community comment, for public comment, and then be brought back to the team for revisions, and then eventually placed on the ballot and sent to the state legislature. So here again, you're sort of seeing a mix of public and private kinds of involvement, negotiation of interests, and participation by the general public. And then on the bottom row, you're seeing opportunities like a cable TV show where people could call in to give their input, and a hotline that was available throughout the process for people to share their opinions. So we could have a whole separate webinar on the work I've done with sort of the public engagement track of this. I wanted to spend more time talking about the consensus process, but I think it's very important to think through who might have an interest in whatever it is you're trying to build consensus on, and in what ways they might be given a chance to share their views. Here's another version of process mapping that I think is even more relevant to a state legislature. This is a depiction of a process for negotiated rulemaking, which is something that is very common at the federal level and might be common in some of your legislatures. And here you had essentially a group that was going to be meeting on a regular basis to discuss the development of rules relative to, I think it was crane safety in this case. It was a Cranes and Derricks Negotiated Rulemaking Advisory Committee. Talk about a wild and crazy bunch. And so what you'll see here as you kind of zoom in on it is they would come to some tentative agreements, and then they would, once they've got some of those tentative agreements, they might send that back to their constituents and their superiors to get some feedback, bring that back to the group, revise it, and then eventually produce a consensus regulatory piece of text. So I think this is a particularly useful template for you to use in some of the work you might do in legislatures because of the notion of having that kind of ongoing task force that would be helpful in coming up with consensus. And again, this is from Susan Podziba and her book, Civic Fusion. So I think we've talked about some of the key questions that need to be asked even before starting, but let's just revisit a couple of these. What is the outcome that we're trying to get at? Is it policy? Is it a moving of the needle on the specific quality of life indicators we're trying to address? Is it, something else? And make sure we know what all that is. And then we also, as I said before, need to be very robust in identifying who needs to be at the table. And that could be physically, like who needs to be in a task force, but also who do we need to hear from the public? Who specifically can be a representative? I think one thing that often trips people up in these processes is they pick someone who really is only speaking for their own self-interest, maybe their business's self-interest or their organizational self-interests, as opposed to sort of the broader needs of that perspective. So in other words, like you might have an environmentalist or a member of an environmental organization who is speaking less on behalf of general environmental interests and more just about their particular cause, like the coral reefs or the whales or the trees or what have you. Then you might have a representative of a chamber organization who's just thinking about what will work for that person's restaurant or their business. And so you really need parties that can look at the bigger picture. You also need to understand what's happened so far. What lawsuits have happened on this topic and what were the outputs of those? What ballot measures have there been? What protests have taken place? What other efforts have there been to resolve this? Also, the time and resource constraints. I mean, most of us in legislative work are able to, I think, devote some off-session time to things like this. But once the session gets rolling, it's very difficult to conduct sessions like this against when it comes to that. And, can we get the relevant parties all to come together at the Capitol or somewhere else, or do we need to come up with some alternatives to try to hear from all the different groups and bring about consensus? So all that needs to be determined, I think, on the front end. These are some other design guidelines that are taken from an article in the Public Administration Review put out by the American Society for Public Administration. I think, one of the things that is very important that we haven't talked about so far is that notion of rules and structures to guide the process. I think, we talked about fostering a level of mutual respect. I think that the group needs to agree upon its own set of discussion guidelines, and the process itself needs to have a set of guidelines that dictate kind of how people are going to conduct themselves, because, the minute someone feels like they were shot down in how they offered their input, that's the minute they're going to start to check out, and that can really undermine the prospects for consensus going forward. So I encourage you to review this set of guidelines for, again, how you might be able to create that safe space, mutually respectful space for dialogue. Now, here's one really critical piece of this. We talked a little bit about generating possible solutions. One thing that we often get stuck in when it comes to political discussion, political discourse, is we are very quick to jump to, evaluation of people's recommendations for a solution. So, an interest group or an elected official or somebody will throw out a solution and someone just immediately decides it won't work and says why. Or even the other side of the coin, you might have a group and one person throws out an idea and then, another person says that's fantastic, and then all of a sudden any voices to the contrary are sort of drowned out. So I think that one of the most important elements of a consensus process is balancing a level of divergent discussion and convergent discussion, again, drawing from Sam Kaner's work. In divergent, you would think of the notion of a brainstorm, but I think one of the things that trips us up in a brainstorm is we really don't always honor the promise that no idea is a bad idea. We sometimes let ideas get evaluated right out of the gate. And again, sometimes it's well-intentioned. Someone's trying to support their colleague or whatever. But I think that, starting even with something as simple as, jotting down ideas privately and having those ideas posted so that every idea gets, an airing up on the wall, so to speak. Even that level of simplicity is important to do because without suspending judgment, you really run the risk of making some people feel like their ideas are unwelcomed. It's obviously important to bridge then from the divergent kind of thinking where you're just open to any idea to both putting those ideas, to kind of organize, the disparate pieces of thought into some themes or some categories that make them easier to evaluate, and then really lining up those ideas against those underlying values and interests that you've established that are important to the different interest groups. How well does this idea meet up with the different things that the group said are important to them? And that evaluation may need to happen individually before it happens collectively. But the main thing is to not just simply say that's a bad idea or that'll never work, but I'm not sure that's going to help, with bringing businesses to our state. I'm not sure that's going to help with ensuring high air quality in our state, and why that is. And then, ultimately getting to a place where you find a set of ideas, or maybe one, that will meet, all of those underlying values and interests. And I've written here, cultivate unpopular ideas, because that can be so difficult, especially for elected officials who feel like they ran on a particular platform and they, need to stand up for a particular set of principles. They don't want to be seen as aligning themselves with something that others think is crazy or way out of left field. But I think to get to consensus, you really have to be willing to say, okay, that's an idea. Let the chips fall, and not simply, jump in and say that's just not going to fly, but rather, let the ideas come out and then be in a place where you can evaluate how well they fit with the group's values. This is, just an extension of what we were talking about before. I think we talked about the listing of interests right out front so that we understand what it's essentially the criteria for finding those consensus solutions. That's another way to think of interests. When I've written here check silences, I think that sometimes members of a group or organizations participating in dialogue with the legislature, they may stay quiet because they're uncomfortable, being out front with taking a particular position in support of something. So we can't be sure that their silence means they're okay. We also can't be sure that their silence means that they're very much opposed. We just don't know. So the more that we can get at everybody's take in some form or fashion, the better off we're going to be in terms of finding what that consensus process is. Now, something else that I think is very useful is this idea of having sort of gradients of an agreement scale. And this is not rocket science, but you can do it numerically. I like to do red, yellow, and green, like index cards, for example. So if I am totally in support of something and I have no reservations about it, I'm gonna go with green and hold up my green card, not the citizenship type of green card, but just a green index card. If I have some reservations, but I think I can get behind it, I might have some questions, I'm going to go with yellow. And if I am very concerned and at this point unable to support it for one reason or another, I'm going to use red. Now, I deliberately do this as kind of a scale as opposed to all in favor say aye and all opposed no, because I'm concerned in a consensus process not so much about picking a winner or a loser of a divisive vote, but instead trying to get a solution that everybody can get behind. And so if I have a combination of greens and yellows, I'm in good shape. If I've got a couple of reds in there, then I need to spend some more time refining that proposal to see how I can address the people's concerns that have put up red. So this is just kind of a roadmap that you might consider using to actually get from some proposed ideas to the emergence of consensus. Well, that's all I've got for Thursday for right now, but I'm happy to take other questions. I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat window just yet, but there's so much we could say about this topic, and I deliberately wanted to make sure I didn't take up the entire hour just to leave time for reactions or questions about specific issues that you might have in your states or scenarios you're working on in your legislature. or anything else that came to mind as you listen to me talk. So I will pause there and see from Jessica and Jen and Megan if they see anything yet that folks want to ask. And if not, I'm happy to share a few other thoughts before we close.
So I don't see any questions yet, but we should wait just a little bit. Sometimes it can take a little bit of time for them to come in.
Sure. One thing that I think is, really critical in this work is, this idea of, honoring ideas that people are uncomfortable with. So I just got a really interesting question from Susan. What if an idea is abhorrent? I like that word, abhorrent to the majority of the group. That's absolutely fine, and I think it's important for there to be a space created for that to be said. In other words, people need to feel like they can share an idea and it gets heard, and that they can share how they honestly feel about an idea. The critical thing in terms of conveying your abhorrence is to explain what makes you so uncomfortable, and to do it in a way that doesn't, eviscerate the person and doesn't make it personal, but instead really makes it about how that proposal or idea conflicts with that person's interests. So, Susan, I don't know if you have a particular example that you're thinking of, but for example, let's say someone was proposing that we, as a way to deal with climate change, we chop down all the trees in the state. That would be something that many of us would probably find abhorrent, but we wouldn't say you tree killer in a consensus process. We would figure out a way to to convey that. Now, you've brought up a very specific one of white supremacists, which I think is a very important and timely example. I think one of the things to consider about white supremacists is whether an avowed white supremacist or someone who makes hate of a particular group the foundation of their work would really be invited to have a direct seat at the table here. That would depend. I mean, I think certainly when we're thinking about the whole issue of honoring the Confederacy and thinking about the identity of Southern heritage, I could see there being some circumstances in which someone who identifies as a white supremacist might have a seat at the table. But I think that there's a difference between an idea that someone thinks is not in alignment with their interests and an ideology that they find to be abhorrent. And, speaking personally, I mean, I certainly find certain ideologies abhorrent myself. But again, I'm going to focus on whatever that person, whether it be a white supremacist or some other person with a very different viewpoint than mine, what they're specifically proposing and the idea rather than their ideology. Again, I'm not sure whether that kind of person or that kind of organization would be helpful to have at the table if they're not considered either a key stakeholder or whether they're not committed to the idea of finding consensus with people who think differently than them. That's a key determination for someone formulating a consensus process. Am I assembling a group of people, all of whom are committed to finding consensus, even if it means something less than their top choice? And a lot of white supremacists, for example, might not feel that way. So it's partly a matter of who you bring to the table. But then once a party is at the table, I think it's important to focus much less on their identity and much more on what it is that they're proposing, and try to dispassionately think about whether their ideas connect well with the interests of the group or not. That's a fascinating question, though, and I appreciate you having the courage to bring it forward, because I think it is, as we've seen in Virginia and in other places around the United States, certainly something that is on the minds of elected officials. One other thing that I didn't spend much time talking about is the notion of a person who would lead a process like this. And I think that it can vary, and I think the roles associated with a process like this can vary. You certainly need to have people who can provide the technical expertise to help sort of reality check some of the things that are being proposed. And what I mean by that is not to veto ideas that are being put forth by a group, but rather to explain the limitations from a technical perspective that they might have. So, for example, if some sort of alternative energy kind of proposal was put forward and a technical expert thought it was just, outside the limits of existing technology, I think that's important for those technical experts to be able to offer as an opinion. So I think they're important. I think elected officials who are ultimately charged with making a decision, or their representatives, so someone from a governor's office or someone from the speaker's office or the majority leader or the lieutenant governor, those people I think need to be, if not at all of the meetings, certainly responsible for framing out what the group is going to talk about, either in writing or in person at the beginning, and sort of laying out what they're willing to consider as a solution. And sort of the realm of possibility for them. I also think it can be helpful to have a chairperson if that chairperson is not necessarily one of the people who really needs to be a robust participant, because I think a lot of times it's hard for a chairperson to both be a fair orchestrator of the meeting and also robustly participate with their own opinions. So a lot of times facilitators can be useful who are not at all, involved in the decision making, not at all there to offer an opinion about the solution, but instead simply there to make sure the process runs smoothly, that everybody participates, and that we achieve our goals. So I definitely would encourage you, as you're thinking about how to put these processes together, to look for professionals with that kind of background and expertise. Do we have other questions or concerns or comments that folks wanted to share? I don't know if anybody can see anything that I can't see.
I'm not seeing anything else that's come up in either of the chat boxes. But if anybody does, if they have some questions that they don't necessarily want to put out on the chat, or you're welcome to email me or email Larry with any questions you have after the webinar is over.
And I guess in closing, one thing that I would say as a bit of encouragement, I know we live in a country that seems very much divided. It seems like we are struggling to get people together who think very differently than one another. One of Susan Ponziba's greatest examples in Civic Fusion is that of a pro-choice, pro-life group that she facilitated over the course of many years. Now, it's not as if the pro-choice people became pro-life or vice versa, or they came up with some sort of third pro that they could all be, but it was a remarkable effort that resulted in some key agreements on some specific abortion items in Massachusetts that I think most people would have thought to be unheard of were it not for the work that was done there. I certainly, over the course of my career, have seen people who initially were calling each other names or labeling each other in a certain way. By the end of the effort, shaking hands and hugging. I mean, as cheesy and as unlikely as it seems to have those kumbaya type moments, they do exist. And one of the things that it really takes in order for that to result is an investment of time and in relationship building, not just legislature with interest groups, but amongst the people who are participating in that consensus process. So beyond just having discussions about the topic, the more that you can engender chances for people to really connect on a deep level and see each other as people and not just interests, not just abstract concepts, I think the more likely people are to work that much harder to find common ground. So I certainly encourage that and hope that you can devote the time to that. But as Megan said, I'm happy to be in touch after the fact, and there's all my contact information. Please send me connection requests on LinkedIn and be in touch on email and phone. And I look forward, hopefully, to seeing you at a future NCSL event or perhaps in your capitals on some future occasion.
Well, it looks like we've got one person possibly typing in a question.
Okay. Janine is our icing on the cake here, so we look forward to whatever she has to say. Oh, she's saying thank you. Well, we thank you for participating and for being part of our conversation. And thanks to everybody from Nevada to Florida and all points in between. I was saying to the Nevada folks, I've got my wife in Las Vegas today with her company, so I feel connected to Nevada and I hope it's Nevada. I always heard Nevada, but I think it's Nevada. But it's great to have such a national audience here, and thank you all for your work on behalf of the public and for being a part of this conversation. And please stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Larry. And I would like to thank all of our attendees, and on behalf of the LSS Executive Committee and everyone at NCSL, thank you all for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.